Thank you for that introduction. Hi, my name is Lynn. Like described, I study these birds pictured here. These are American oystercatchers. They are coastal breeding shorebirds. And today I'll be discussing the use of field maps to study their foraging habitat quality. So my work is conducted on a couple of barrier islands in Virginia. These are on the Delmarva Peninsula. These birds breed on beaches along the Atlantic coast of the US. And this is one of the highest concentrations of breeding for the population along their whole breeding range. That's why I study them here. At these sites, I work on two barrier islands. So one of them is Chincoteague, pictured on the northern part, and then Assawoman on the more southern portion of this photo. And at both of these locations, they've been facing population decline and really low breeding success. So they're not fledging enough chicks given the number of breeding pairs. So I'm interested in exploring factors that might contribute to this decline. One thing that could be important is foraging habitat quality. And the reason for this is that these birds provision their chicks for 60 days after they hatch, which is a really long time period for shorebirds, especially given the fact that they fledge after 35 days old. So because of this really lengthy provisioning period, this is why foraging habitat quality might be linked to reproductive success. And these birds feed on bivalves, so these might be mussels, oysters, clams, or other marine invertebrates. These are the kinds of habitat that they will feed at in Virginia. So the top left are bayside mudflats where they will dig for clam species. The top right are restored oyster reef castles. The bottom right are marshy areas with ribbed mussels and oysters. And the bottom left are peat banks with false angel wing clams and other invertebrate species. And they also feed on oceanside shorelines on different marine invertebrates. And so to study foraging habitat quality for these birds, I go out and make behavioral observations on focal individuals for 10 minutes, where I record what they feed in terms of the prey species, the size of those prey, and how much of that they feed their chicks, and where they feed in terms of whether they're feeding on the ocean side or the bay side and the specific microhabitat. And it's this where question where field maps comes into play. So I need to be able to pinpoint exactly where these birds feed when I see them. So when I'm out there and I start seeing a feeder bird, I get really excited because they do a lot of sleeping generally. And so I created this field maps app, which allows me to drop a GPS point of where they're feeding. And I can associate that with additional information. So this is what it looks like on my mobile device. And so I can input information about the time that they're feeding relative to the tidal cycle, the bird's individual identification, as well as the behavior and the prey and other things going on. So in general, Field Maps is a mobile app device through ArcGIS that allows you to drop GPS locations and associate this type of attribute information. And it's really handy to use in the field. And another feature that's really useful with this are drop-down menus and other ways to limit the types of data you might input into field maps. So I found drop-down menus really useful in this instance because it helps make your data collection more uniform across individuals. So if you have multiple techs working on a project, inputting data, it just makes everything more consistent. And so to make this type of app, I first started by making a geodatabase in ArcPro that gets uploaded onto ArcGIS Online, where you would create a map, and then you can customize the look of this map app in Field Apps. After going out and making these observations during the season, I would end up with a map that looks something like this that indicates the foraging locations for these birds. So you'll see a high concentration of points in that open water region. Those are oyster reefs that they're feeding on. The surrounding areas generally are bayside mudflats or marshes where they're feeding on ribbed mussels and oysters, as well as digging for clams. And then there is some feeding on that oceanside shoreline on mole crabs and coquina. After plotting the foraging locations for these birds, I wanted to then go out and sample the prey to determine food availability. So I took these locations and I delineated polygons for their foraging areas. And then I created random points within those feeding areas to go sample using the random points tool in ArcMap to establish 10 sampling points per feeding area. I created another field maps app to give me something like this. So these are our different sampling points. And what was useful here was denoting the status of completion of these points using a color. So this was a way to track which areas we had already sampled and which ones still needed to be visited. So red would be a place that needed to be visited, yellow would be a revisit, and green would be complete. And so this was a really easy way to communicate among multiple technicians which points needed to be sampled. And a user could click on an individual point to pull up more information about the status and of that point. When we went out to these points to sample, we were counting the number of bivalves within a 0.5 meter square quadrat and measuring the length of these bivalves to get the size distribution. We also collected some environmental sampling parameters that might be driving prey distribution, including water quality like salinity and dissolved oxygen, as well as chlorophyll and sediment samples for organic matter and sediment size. So this is year 1 of a 3-season project. I'm planning on continuing with our behavioral observations on chick provisioning and foraging measures, as well as the environmental sampling. And then I'll be taking that data to make a foraging hotspot map. And eventually I will be relating all of that information of habitat use back to food availability and patterns in reproductive success for these birds. And something that I'm looking forward to next year is deploying GPS data loggers onto some of our birds. These are devices that can record the fine scale spatial movement of the birds within plus or minus 10 meters. So it can pinpoint individual microhabitats of exactly where they are feeding. And so it can give us data that looks something like this, so we can better identify distant foraging areas, as well as identify foraging site fidelity and determine information about when the birds feed relative to the tidal cycle and the day-night cycle. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the field crew who has helped on this project, as well as the map library for hosting today and their support in creating some of those field maps. And we'll take any questions.